On Independence Day, Donald Trump did a really weird thing, dipped in double standards and irony. Intrigued? Then click that like and subscribe and enjoy the video. So yesterday was Independence Day, July 4th, America's birthday, and every political figure of every political persuasion probably made some sort of public statement about that very historic date. Donald Trump, the leader of the Republican Party, the former president of the United States, and the federally indicted candidate for the 2024 presidency, well, he also issued a public statement, kinda, and he did so in a predictably weird and narcissistic way. So I want to cover it because there are actually some interesting implications, both with respect to double standards that we have for politicians, as well as the irony inherent to what Trump did. So Trump at, it says 8:30 p.m. on July 4th, shared this image, which presumably he did not draw himself. Perhaps he had it commissioned. I wouldn't be surprised if this was framed and hanging somewhere in Mar-a-Lago, perhaps near some classified or national defense information. And it appears to be an image of Trump in what appears to be like a Revolutionary War depiction, right? It looks like he's basically superimposed, his giant orange head is superimposed over what would otherwise have been then General Washington. And the first thing I want to comment on is this is really weird. You would not see anything like this from President Biden, President Obama, President Clinton, any Democratic president, or actually, quite frankly, you probably wouldn't see this from most Republican presidents either. I can't imagine George W. Bush, when he was running for the presidency, or when he was president, or Mitt Romney for that matter, ever doing something so weirdly self-aggrandizing or narcissistic. The implication here, of course, is that Donald Trump is some sort of, American superhero in much the same way as we view now President Washington, leading some sort of revolution against, a tyrannical monarchy, right? Because that's what George Washington did, right? He led the efforts to overthrow the British crown and emancipate the American colonies from British rule. Now, the first thing I want to comment on is the double standard. Again, it's hard to imagine any Democratic president ever pulling something like this off. Imagine how Republicans and even centrists or the mainstream media would react if Joe Biden did this. Like, you don't even have to look at Fox News. Fox News obviously would just be apoplectic. But imagine how CNN, the New York Times, and even like MSNBC, how they would react if Joe Biden did something like this, if he posted this on social media, something basically beatifying and aggrandizing himself in this way. We'd probably be really weirded out and we'd call it out. But for Trump, it's par for the course. And as a matter of fact, I imagine his supporters quite like that. It's really weird. It's food for thought. Again, goes to show the double standards that we hold Republican politicians and Trump to compared to Democrats, including the mainstream media and centrist media as well. But the other thing I want to point out is, again, Trump is trying to conjure the image of President Washington, then General Washington. And again, full disclosure, I've mentioned this in previous streams. In many ways, George Washington, despite his many faults, is my favorite president. He's the one that interests me the most because he was not only the first, but he was the one for whom the office was effectively built. If you look at the Constitution, Article 2 of the Constitution, which covers the executive branch, the presidency, information about it was relatively skeletal because they imagined that George Washington would be the first president, which he was. And so he would be able to dictate what that office was. That's how much trust they had in George Washington, who, of course, turned down absolute power at the end of the Revolutionary War when he resigned his commission. And then again, at the end of his second term, when he refused to run for a third term. There was no constitutional amendment or federal law requiring him to step down. He could have run again and again and again and effectively have been a dictator for life, but he chose not to. He gave up power twice, absolute power twice. But what I want to draw attention to is Washington's, and by the way, you should definitely check out this book by Alexis Coe. It's probably the best Founding Fathers autobiography that I've ever read, and it's called You Never Forget Your First. And it's a tongue-in-cheek but remarkably candid historic autobiography of President Washington. It covers the good, the bad, the ugly. George Washington as a husband, a president, a general, and a slaver, right? It goes into all of the moral pitfalls of this man that we beatify. But the other thing I want to draw attention to is George Washington's farewell address. So it's ironic, in addition to the double standards, what Trump is doing here. So he's trying to conjure that impression of George Washington. But here's an important part from Washington's farewell address. This is the speech he gave the nation when he left office. Again, setting the stage for like farewell remarks. He says, all obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of constituted authorities, are destructive of this fundamental principle and that of fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in place of the delegated will of the nation, the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration of the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction. That word again. He's referring, of course, to the tendency at the time for people to factionalize to groups, basically the forebears of what we would now know as the political parties. He was warning against them in part of his farewell address. He's like, listen, party factions and factional politics will basically doom this nation. And nobody says, however combinations or association of the above description may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. So in that part of George Washington's farewell speech, he's warning against party politics and factions. That warning went unheeded, obviously. But he also prophesied. He didn't come out and say it directly, obviously, because he's not literally a prophet. But Washington predicted the rise of men like Donald Trump, cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men who will seek to subvert the power of the people and usurp for themselves the reins of government and then destroy afterwards the means that got them there, so the electoral process and democracy. That fits Donald Trump to a T. So as Donald Trump is trying to conjure the image of George Washington, he has desecrated the legacy of George Washington to a far greater extent than any Democrat or Republican president before him. You also look at, again, the peaceful transfer of power, a tradition that George Washington himself set up for 200 plus years, from every president from Washington all the way up until Donald Trump. That tradition, which is arguably the most important civic tradition we have, was respected, and then Trump broke it. He's the first president to ever do that. So the point is, even as Donald Trump tries to basically paint himself as the new George Washington, he is the literal very opposite, and nobody should forget it.